Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. We are very happy to be with you today for this very nice side event that we've organized over the last couple of months called Financing Local Solutions as a Means to Climate Justice that Leaves No One Behind. To welcome us to this event, I have the pleasure to introduce to you His Excellency, the Minister of Environment of Ecuador, Mr. Gustavo Manrique. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, as you said, Andres, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening in any part of the world you are. For me, it's a pleasure to be here, standing here with such a high-level colleagues that will share their experiences, our experiences, and that we will be much better persons with best information in order to make better decisions. I want to say thanks to all the partners that have made real this event, and I hope that the next minutes we will share this information that will be very good for all our countries. Thank you very much, and let's start the event.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, for your words, for your kind words. Now, to also welcome us to this event, we have the National Director of Climate Change of Peru, Madame Rosa Morales. Rosa, you also have the floor to welcome us to this event.
Thank you very much. I would like first to give the regards from our Minister Rubén Ramírez to this event, which addresses a very important issue, which has to do with financing local solutions as a means to climate justice that leaves no one behind. In Peru, the impacts of climate change, of course, have to do a lot with our territories, with our local communities and vulnerable population. In Peru, the climatic challenge that we have at this level of the communities and rural people is very, very much high. It has not only to do with capacity building or access to technical means, and also the challenge of bringing together new technology with traditional knowledge, but it's also part of the access to financial, public, and private resources. So this access would lead or let our populations to develop their adaptation local solutions. In this regard, in Peru, we are developing our integral management of climate change that includes these populations, specifically all the stakeholders in the different levels of governments and the different non-state actors, such as indigenous populations, the Afro-Peruvian community, youth, and so forth. So with this, we thank again the opportunity to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words, Rosa. Now, I will give you a very brief introduction of the event that we have in front of us, of the agenda that we will go through. We have a very nice panel today composed of people from all over the world. On one hand, His Excellency, the Minister of Environment of Ecuador, Gustavo Manrique. With us is also Dr. James Sangale. James is Chief Officer for Environment at the County Government of Kajiado in Kenya. We have Melchior Lengsfeld. Melchior is Executive Director of Helvetas Swiss Intercooperation and President of Alliance 2015. Welcome, Melchior. We have Tisa Mafira connecting remotely. Tisa is Associate Director of the Climate Policy Initiative in Indonesia. And we will have closing remarks by Bianca Kreshmer of the Adaptation Fund. We also have, as part of our panel, and I see you connector there, Anju, I'm glad to have you here. We have also part of our panel, Anju Sharma, who is lead at locally led adaptation, at the locally led Action Global Center on Adaptation. So welcome, Tisa, and welcome Andrew from afar. To begin our event, we will have a quick scene-setting presentation on an analytic perspective of local adaptation to climate change and the challenges for its funding. As you know, the focus of the event will be to have an exchange on solutions, barriers, challenges that local communities have to accessing climate change and to accessing climate finance in particular. And this is, of course, of relevance and of particular importance because it's local communities who are those that are most affected by the effects of climate change and who, in many cases, have the biggest need, I would say, for that climate finance. So to help us warm up and get into the scene, I would like to invite Anju to give her scene-setting presentation for us today before we begin the panel. So Anju, the floor is yours. Anju, can you unmute your phone? I'm sorry, your mic, we can't hear you. She says she can't unmute herself. Somebody else has to unmute her, maybe? Okay, can you try again, Anju? You seem to be muted. Okay, while Anju returns, we're having some technical issues to making sure that Anju is connected. I would very briefly like to go into part of the content for the event.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Anju.
Yes,
We can
I
finally hear you.
Sorry about that.
I was going to go ahead and give the scene-setting presentation myself, but we're happy to hear from you. Go ahead, please.
Now, let me see if I can share my screen. That's the next technical challenge we face. This is not like any other system that I've used so far, I'm afraid. There you go. Now I can. And we have... Can you now see the screen that I have?
No, we are looking at you.
Oh, dear. So I've just shared my screen. What have I... Really sorry about this. Entire screen, share. Now, do you see it? No, still not.
No, we don't.
Do I need a special permission of any sort to share?
No, we are told that you don't, but maybe if you're able to, could you go ahead with your presentation without sharing the screen?
Okay, that's a real shame because I actually had some pictures to start off with, but maybe I can try and describe it because, Andre, thank you very much, by the way, for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure. Now, you know, there have been several discussions that have happened on finance to the local level, but I think that sometimes we get so caught up in this really complicated labyrinth that we've created for ourselves from the top, and we get caught in the bureaucracy of things that we lose sight of what it is that we're trying to do. So I actually wanted to start off by showing you a few pictures, and since I can't, I'll try and describe them to you. But basically, I wanted, you know, to share a story from when I started in this field. This was a few years ago, quite a few years ago now. And I was traveling, I was a foot soldier, so to speak, for a magazine in India called Down to Earth. And I was traveling in Orissa. some of you may know that state from the awful cyclone that hit it in 1999. But I was in a place called Simlipal Tiger Reserve. We're writing on a project which involves the displacement of tribal communities from this forest. And something I saw there really stuck with me, because I took this sort of series of pictures. I was talking to one of the tribal women who lived on the edge of the forest. All she had was one hut and a patch of land around it. And she produced paddy on that patch of land. She got, maybe one sack of it per season. If she was lucky, she would get a second crop the next season. But as we were talking, this man walked out of the forest, and I've never seen a sight like it. It was, he was bent over, wearing a sack, and he'd literally been in the forest collecting berries over a period of a month, which he brought out. And then I witnessed, in this day and age, a barter going on. She gave him rice, and in return, he gave her, some of the berries and things that he'd collected. So, I mean, these are people who are not even connected to the economies as we know it. So they're sort of out of there's no money changing hands there. And now, Simlipal recently, I mean, as in many other parts of the world, because they don't get enough precipitation, because the forests are drier, they've been having forests. So just last year, for instance, they had forest fires are coming earlier, and they're more frequent. And they had a forest fire, and there was a story about how these tribes that live in the forest, for them, it's literally they're watching their livelihoods, their energy source, their food source being razed to the ground. And they have very little help from their communities. I mean, so if they had any assets, maybe they would be able to go to loan sharks and get some money to tide over these extremely difficult periods of time. But they don't have those assets. So the next port of call is local governments. But as we all know, that in parts of the world, even where these local governments exist, they have very limited budgets. They have very limited fiduciary control of the money that comes to them. It's already been, allocated for some other activity. They have very limited capacity to access funds from even national sources, forget about international sources. Climate change is definitely an additional burden to them. I mean, they're already dealing in sort of firefighting mode over development issues. And on top of that, we have these increased threats from climate change that they're forced to deal with. They don't have basically the technical capacity or the information that they need to be able to deal with it properly. And they need a lot of help for them to be able to accountable to the communities and to provide sort of immediate support that the most vulnerable need to adapt and deal with climate-related losses. Because literally what it means is that, if the communities don't receive help in a timely manner, you're going to unravel whatever little development benefits we've been able to achieve in these past few years. So they have one event like that can cause years and years of going back on things like health and education and provision of energy, etc. So, I mean, now the next port of call are the state and national governments, and they are also struggling. There are very heavy demands being made, financial demands that are being made on the budgets that they have. The different sectors and sort of the finance ministries are paying a cost for climate change. They also have limited capacity to access international funding. We've heard it again and again about how the access modalities are so complicated. You need external consultants to come in and do these proposals for them. Invariably, this means that they, rather than focus on what's going on at the local level, they tend to focus on what's going on nationally, so-called big bang projects. We've actually heard this from, bureaucrat who we were trying to convince to do activities at the local level, to submit a proposal at the GCF. And he said, no, we need big bang projects because they just don't see the value return for all the work that they have to put into access for small projects. Then they have to deal with, all the varied reporting requirements, the preferences of the multilateral and bilateral sources of funding. To be honest, there's no planning that they can do that's realistic, because unless you have actually an idea of how much money you have, you can't do realistic planning. You can do blue sky planning. So for instance, in India, the state governments were asked to come up with action plans, and they came up with, here's everything we need, and they often, the budgets they presented were bigger than their state budgets. So because, they didn't have a budget envelope to plan on, and it was totally unrealistic planning. And then, of course, the other huge problem that they face is that whatever money they get from international sources, they can't make it work with national budgets, usually because there are requirements on them which, need them to silo the funding that's coming from different sources and use it in different ways. Then, so that's the national level story, but to look then at the international, the sources of funding, they can either go to bilateral partners, and that you know how fragmented that is, how different the access modalities and the reporting requirements again over there are. Different bilateral donors have their own sort of darlings and favorites and activities that they want. When the LDCs were doing their national adaptation programs of action, one of the things that the chair of the LDC expert group mentioned at an event that I was presenting at was that they're increasingly hearing about the napability of activities. So there's very little national determination, forget about subnational or local determination in the sort of activities that eventually get funded. And these, again, bilateral funding, there's little coherence, there's little coordination. In the context of ODA, we've at least made some progress with the Paris Declaration, with the Accra Action Agenda, etc., where there's been, push for donors to be more coordinated and coherent in the funding that they provide to reduce the burden on the recipients. But in the context of climate change, it's almost like we've gone back. There's very little of that happening. And again, these funds don't work with national budgets, they don't work with national processes, they don't work with national institutions. We're often trying to recreate, whether it's little bodies, so adaptation committees at the local level, etc., rather than working through local governments. These are all small projects. They don't add up. They don't allow for economies of scale. So, they're literally still in the modeling phase, more or less. They're often repeating what national governments are doing in different contexts. And it's very much a similar story with the multilateral funding partners, because, as I said, the local communities are not going to be able to access funds from funds like the Green Climate Fund or the GEF or the World Bank, etc., because of the, prolonged access modalities. There's been talk about how a project could take 22 months longer to go through the whole system. That's already too late for the kind of urgent and immediate help that communities often need. And the big problem is that we're still working very much in the project-based modality, where you have to predefine what it is that you will do, and that decision on whether the activity will go ahead or not is taken way far away in Songdo or Washington or wherever. So there's no potential currently, very little potential for national determination or local determination even more. And of course, the pot of funding is very limited. Now, we've made some progress with regard to the multilateral funding institutions because, after years, after seeing the problems that arose with the GEF, very similar problems that we're seeing now, that it takes so long, that it's so difficult, the modalities are so complicated, we had pushed for direct access, first with the Adaptation Fund. What that helped do was cut out sort of one difficulty in the picture, which was that we didn't have to work with intermediary international institutions anymore. National governments or national institutions could go ahead and apply for funding. So that took a while for us to build the kind of capacities that are needed at the national level. And then when the GCF was being formed, we pushed that now this has to go to a step further. So we made it easier for national governments to access funding. Now we have to make it easier for local communities and local governments to access funding. And the idea behind this enhanced direct access modality was very much that this would be programmatic funding. That, as long as there's a broad definition of how this is going to help communities adapt, you could devolve the decision making to the national and subnational levels, and there would be flexibility that for communities to decide what the activities are. Now, unfortunately, that's had very little uptake for a great many reasons. And we'll come to talking about what those reasons are in a minute. But just to remember that in the context of the bilateral and multilateral funding, currently it's very fragmented. It's not getting to where it needs to go. And fragmented funding essentially delivers fragmented action. There's no predictability, and so governments are not able to make long-term plans or have consolidations or coherence, etc., even at the national level. So what are the sort of main problems that we see? And, I'm going to say this, but I really feel that we have just continued to treat climate finance like overseas development assistance and to use the complex ODA rules and systems that we had. Whereas I think this is very much a very different cup of tea, that this is harm that's been caused to communities. And it's not the communities that should be accountable to funders, but we need to turn that around and to make funders accountable to communities. It's their sort of task to make sure that the funding, whether it's the funders or the national governments, to get it down to the local communities. So we need to really change that. Then, we've already heard that we need to make the international landscape for climate finance. It needs to be made less complex and to deliver action on the scale that's required, not to carry on with what we've done in the past, which is a small activity there, doesn't add up to anything. And finally, I think literally we're sometimes tend to look at it upside down because we expect the communities to build the capacity to access international funding. But I think that's really absurd. What we should be doing instead is looking at how we make the funding available more easily to communities. How do we get it down there? The funding should go to the communities, not the other way around. So what do we need? I think yesterday, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, he used the term, we need to rewire the financial system for the net zero target. I think what we need very much is also to rewire the financial system so that it works for those communities that are being harmed and so that they can access the funding. And we need to rework the system so that there's accountability to those communities, to those that are impacted by climate change. And that literally calls for a sort of reversing of the way we do business right now. We need simple funding systems. The funding should go to those in need, not vice versa. They shouldn't have to come to governments or to global funds. We need programmatic funding. We need budgetary support. As I said, that again is something that we've tried in the past in the context of ODA, which is funds that are made part of national budgets so that they can actually filter down. They've been successful. The OECD themselves did a review a couple of years ago that showed that they do work. So I don't know why we're not exploring those in this context. We need more predictable funding to allow that kind of coherence to take place at the national level so governments know that this is how much funding is coming and this is the planning we can do over this period of years. So there's a certain amount of certainty that's built in. And also so that they can make sure that, there are systems that can deliver funding at the local level after disasters happen, after climate impacts hit, so that they can, yeah?
Sorry to interrupt you, but we're going into the panel time. Could you maybe start to close?
I'm just finishing. So I'm just sort of listing what needs to be done, predictable funding, additional funding, so we don't compromise development goals, flexible funding so that, you can't always predict what the climate crisis and impacts will be. And you need patient funding because you can't expect results. You're working in a difficult context with limited capacity. You can't expect results very quickly over whatever 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. You need efficient funding that encourages the climate finance to work with development processes and institutions, etc. You need real partnerships. I really wanted to go into that, but perhaps we can during the panel discussion on what that means, because currently different partners are pushing in different directions. I think we all need to learn to push together in the same direction. You definitely need funding for local capacity, but in a way that it can be sustained and retained, not the fragmented way that it's delivered now. And then finally, I'd like to end with saying that, we've had in the recent past, there's been groups and countries that have made commitments to specific concrete goals of finance that they will deliver at the local level. So in Nepal, for instance, as part of their LAPA process, local adaptation plans of adaptation, they had said that they would, I think it was their goal was 80% would go to local communities. The LDC group has made a similar commitment in their 2050 vision. Why can't we at the global level? Why can't global funds like the GCF say that we're going to ensure that a vast majority of the funding is going to go to the local level? And then finally, we need ways to measure that there is progress on these sort of commitments, that the funding is reaching where it's going, and that there is the level of accountability and, to communities who should be the final arbitrators of whether projects and activities have been a success, not some sort of complex M&E systems that we build on the top, because they mean very little at the end. So I'll stop there, Andre. Sorry for going over time, and also sorry for the technical failure with my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Anju. I think it's been very helpful to remind us of realities on the ground. Usually at these level of discussions at the COP, we tend to forget about realities on the ground. And I even wanted to bring some of the main issues that you highlighted in your presentation. I think first is, of course, I've been mentioning this, be aware of reality on the ground, of what's actually happening, what's actually hitting local communities. The fact that local communities have limited capacities, which tends to make them rely on local or federal governments or even intermediaries to access climate finance. And of course, the last message that you said that really resonated to me was that funding needs to move towards local communities instead of the other way around, which is usually something that we tend to hear very much on these discussions, particularly on the finance side. So with that, I will open the panel. We have many questions for our panelists. I think the first one was what are some of the constraints or the obstacles that you see for local communities to access climate finance, and Anju has made a very detailed response on that. So I'm going to skip to our second question. And our second question is focused on why. I think, Anju, you've also tried to respond to that, but I would like to give an opportunity to our panelists. I didn't make reference to this at the beginning, but our panel is comprised of different sectors, which makes it for a richer discussion. We have, of course, the Minister of Environment giving the perspective of federal, local, of a federal national government. We have James on the side of a local government. We have Melchior on the side of the international cooperation, and we have Tisa on the side of a think tank. So it's interesting to hear from different perspectives in that sense, and I hope that the discussions will be made much more richer by our diversity. So the first question that I wanted to bring, and probably I'll bring this to James, if you will. We've heard about some of the challenges that the communities are having to access climate finance. Why do you think, or why have you seen, sir, in your experience, that this is the case? I mean, why, besides some of the reasons that Anju already highlighted, why do you see that local communities are having these issues to access climate finance?
Thank you very much. I think the same issue raised by, is it Aju? That's
Anju,
the name?
yes.
Aju? The same issues affecting my local government, that is Kajiado. That's a local kind of government, and mostly the capacity and the awareness. People in the local authorities or communities are not aware of some of these fundings. And we are working as if climate change will wait for us. And what's happening is that our priorities sometimes are not right. Even if we have got insufficient budgets, we do not put the right adaptation measures in place. Sometimes we're also affected by lack of policies and regulations. And this idea of accessing funds, whereby there's a lot of bureaucracies in getting some of these funds, they make the most vulnerable people in the society continue suffering. Like now, there is talk of getting funding for the last 3 years. You are being told you must do this kind of a procedure before you access this money, and yet our people are still suffering. So I think we need to look at the aspect of limited capacity, and more so what she has talked about, technical capacity. Do we have technical capacity at that level? Or do we just concentrate on the national level to build capacity of the people there and accessing funds from that? Why can't we get access direct to the local communities? So what I will say that climate change issues cannot wait. And what we need to do is to ensure the local governments are able to access the funding direct, not going through the national government. And this idea of having some accreditation groups whereby we must go through those bodies for us to get the funding, and yet the most vulnerable in the society, and these are women who suffers most, being in a rural kind of a county, are still suffering. So I think we need to at least relax some of these kind of measures. Okay, ensure we have got proper policies, but I think the steps which we keep on being told, follow these to get these, we need to shorten the process.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer, James. I think it was very helpful. Just to start focusing on solutions, because the idea of the event was also to focus on solutions, I would like to go into our next question for the panel, and our next question focuses on what are some of the measures or efforts that your either organization, government, think tank has undertaken to promote access to climate finance towards local communities. Can you provide details of some of the challenges that these local communities in your country have had to access finance, and how solutions or best practices have helped overcome them? So basically, we are inviting you to provide a small presentation, I would say, small details on a solution, an example where some of these challenges that we've been addressing have been overcome. And I would maybe like to start with Tisa. Tisa, I know you're connected from Indonesia, so thank you very much, Tisa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. I'll provide a little story from a study that we at Climate Policy Initiative Indonesia did in a village in East Kalimantan, where we worked for a while, which highlights a challenge for us. So I'll start with a challenge, which is that when it comes to accessing finance, communities are even having trouble defining their needs, right? Because they have many needs. And when it comes to climate resilience, there's the need to adapt, which is the need to alleviate potential suffering that they might suffer from climate crisis and disasters. But there's also the need to empower themselves in a way that mitigates emissions as well. So that's a complex situation for them to have to define what their needs is. And then the second part is then accessing finance that then addresses their needs. So most often the finance is already defined for them, and they have to craft a narrative that fits the financing criteria instead of the financing fitting the needs of the communities. And so this was very apparent in the village that I was working with in East Kalimantan, where the financing available was for capacity building to villages to help them establish, sustainable palm oil, with the assumption that these villagers were already working on palm oil, that was their livelihood, and that all they needed to do was to make it sustainable somehow. But when we went into the villages and did our research and data collection, what we found was that they didn't necessarily like doing palm oil. They didn't necessarily feel that it was, they were prospering from palm oil, because there was deep competition from medium-sized and big-sized plantations that they weren't necessarily happy with. Plus, it was it was a situation where they used to be planting all these kinds of diverse crops. They used to plant, corn and rice and pepper, but all of that gradually decreased and became replaced with palm oil, with monocrops, basically. So now they're, not only are they not too happy with palm oil, they're also not very food secure. So this is then the issue is, how do they then access the finance when they can't articulate this issue, right? They can't articulate how this is actually what we need. We don't actually need financing for sustainable palm oil. What we do need is financing for us to be able to plant all these types of varied crops, for us to go over the risks of having to try out a crop, if it doesn't work, replant the crop and keep replanting until it does work, and then they're safe for the next few years. So that kind of need had to be defined and had to be narrated first. And the issue that I had was that we were there to help. We were there to say, okay, we can craft the financial modeling, we can help speak to banks and development institutions so that some form of finance could be cobbled together for the specific needs that you want. But it was quite uncomfortable to act as a consultant in this case, as I felt that they should be doing this, they should have the capacity, or the funders should be accountable to them, as Anju said, and the funders should be talking to them and asking them what they need and making it simple for them to access it based on what they need. I'll stop there first.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Tisa. I think the message that you really left for us is something that I myself am involved in the climate negotiations in the finance stream. And something that we always say is that climate action tends, at least in developing countries, climate action tends to be designed based on the offer of finance instead of the offer being based on the needs and on the demands of local communities. That's, of course, a challenge that we always face. I would now like to focus the same question, the invitation to hear from specific case or experience to Melchior. So Melchior, can you share with us any experience where you have seen these challenges being overcome or solved by anything that you have been involved in?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Andres. So generally, I would like to take you maybe to an example in the Andes, but listening to Anju and to Tisa, it's really that resonates so much. So my organization, Helvetas, is working in 30 countries. And as an alliance of European NGOs, Alliance 2015, we're working in 85 countries. And the analysis that we heard from Anju and the example that we heard now from Indonesia, that's exactly experience in most of those countries. And so what we see, the attention to the adaptation question at the local level, that's just not high enough today. So that is why I really appreciate that we can have that discussion. Now let's come to the Andes. So one project that we are facilitating, Andes Resilientes, is really picking up the situation of that the population in the Andes, farming families, they are hugely exposed to climate change. Securing food for the coming years, securing access to water is a huge challenge and quickly deteriorating in many contexts. And then when you look what's the offer, there's not enough climate funding and it's very difficult to access. So what we found really interesting around that initiative, that the
national governments of Ecuador, of Peru, of Bolivia said, we need to devise an approach where that support, that reactive action, adaptive action is not only designed at the national level, but where the local communities most in need, they can have a role in that. Local governments can have a role in that. And that is where the Swiss government responded to say we can finance such a process. And the Fundación Avina and Helvetas together are facilitating this process with local governments, with national governments to say, first, what would be an inclusive process to define such adaptive policies? What actually needs to be done, not in the view of experts only at national level or at a level far away from the communities, but what's the local perception on those things? And then once that is established, and these are the policies, then to say, okay, now how can we bridge it to the existing climate financing instruments? In this case, there is program development intended for financing from the Green Climate Fund, but that is so complicated that it needs years to devise a mechanism that funding really flows. And the challenge that we see is the mechanisms today of the financing of the Green Climate Fund, they're not devised to bring this money down to the local level. So that is the innovative part of the program, to say, okay, here we need to work on those mechanisms that in the end, those who decide on how the money is really spent, despite all the fiduciary requirements, that is really stays with the local communities. So far for that example from the Andes, I would just want to add that there is a huge amount of good practice and great experience for local funding, for resilient solutions, for adaptive solutions. And it's also a matter of making those local experiences part of the discussion. For instance, there is an alliance, Voices for Climate Action, who has just, in a recent study funded by HIVOS, documented experiences, how that can work. So bringing those field experiences into the international discussion, how the funding instruments are devised, that seems crucial to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that response, Melchior. It's very nice to hear from Andes Resilientes. It's a really nice project, I hear. I would like to now bring this question to you, Minister. Can you tell us about an experience that Ecuador is having to help local communities access climate finance?
Well, sure. Thanks again for convening this event. I'm very happy to be here and learn from you. Yes, I would like to share a couple of short examples of what we have done. We are being involved in payment for results, the RED Plus, that the GCF gave us $18.5 million because of accomplished of reduction of deforestation. And those resources go to the community, and then they as well protect those areas. That's like the first example that I want to share with you with that. Besides that, we have worked with the indigenous people as well with roundtables to help them. Basically, I agree with you that the needs, it's very tough procedures and the lack of knowledge how to access to these resources. So with the COFENIAE, we have worked together, and we have gave them to the indigenous people $2.5 million in order to increase their capacity, to their resilience, and their abilities to fight to climate change. There is another example that I want to share with you, that we have a program, very nice program, named Sociobosque. In Sociobosque, with international cooperation and economic local effort, we have been protected not to deforest 1.6 million hectares by paying the people for the ecosystemic services that our forest gives. With that being said, we have 2,500 2,500 agreements with people, with communities that are involved, around 200,000 people that is not deforesting in order to fight climate change. This is a very interesting program. 80% of those payments, we pay around $11 million to them, and with that money, they have to do ¿cómo se dice? Bioemprendimientos. Bioentrepreneurship, that they come out with a certification of free of deforestation. So those are strategies, specific examples with a RED Plus, with Sociobosque, and to end with another very good way of fighting climate change in terms of resilience and among others. We're a very big country with a lot of mangrove, and we have created a system that we work together with crab associations in order to protect the mangrove. You know that they play a very important role, the mangrove, in the ecosystem. So they are in charge of that area, and we as well pay them to protect it. So in terms of results, it's like putting the carrot with the people, with the population, in order to understand that conservation and production should be together in order to fight the climate change. So those are some examples that specifically, in a practical way, we're working with the communities with very good results.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Minister. It's very heartening to hear that local communities are also managing the resources themselves. And in the case of Ecuador, I'm glad to hear about those examples. I'd like to bring the same question back to you, James, if possible. Could you tell us about an example where you have seen local communities access climate finance resources?
Thank you very much. And as I mentioned earlier, for us to do some of these activities, we were to ensure we have proper legislation in place. Because when there is proper policies in place, things get easier. But I will say that one of program supported by HIVOS was on clean energy. And clean energy, we were trying to look at what are these alternatives. We are telling people not to cut trees. We are telling people to conserve forest. We had to use the communities in ensuring that we are using clean energy for cooking. And what we did is first we had to develop an atlas. We had to do like a baseline survey with the help of HIVOS to bring to speed people to identify locally, because of ownership, what kind of clean energy can we use in this given area? Is it wind? Is it solar? And all that. So we were able to map up all that, and we developed an atlas which can be used. Then we had to train the local citizens on the same, on how they can be able to increase the tree cover, even not the forest cover, by not cutting and using the alternative sources of energy. So that's a program which is on, and I can say that it is proving that we are able to increase the tree cover and having ensuring that our local communities, the most vulnerable, are able to have alternatives on cooking. So to me, that's a very thing, is one project which is on, and I'm very happy that if any investors come into the county, can be able to get a document, a baseline for them to start off. And as we are saying that by 2020, we need to increase the tree cover by more than 10%. As a local government, we are in for that. Because again, through the same initiative, we're encouraging youth and women to come up with clear tree nurseries, whereby they can use the same kind of trees or seedlings to improve on their farmlands as they support the same initiative. So to me, that's what I can say. But the first thing is involvement also of our local assemblies, because for us to be able to get to that is to ensure we are working with them. These are the people who are doing the legislation within the county. They have to believe and appreciate what we are doing and pass relevant legislation for us to be able to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, James. Last but not least, Anju, I've left you for last, but could you maybe share a specific example that you have seen with respect to this issue?
Yeah, you can hear me. So definitely, I'd like to make 2 points, Andre. Actually, yes, there are very good examples out there. One that I worked on a while ago was the local adaptation plan of actions in Nepal. And that was really brilliant, because when Nepal was asked to do their NAPAs, they went back home and started work on it and realized this really doesn't make that much sense. We actually need to go down to the local level and have these LAPAs. And so they set in place a process to develop these NAPAs, and they've been implementing, they've been learning, and there's some really strong learning that's come out of that process. You have very good examples of the county climate funds in Kenya. And I think we need a lot more of those, where the funding is available at the local level, so communities can access it easily, that it's available if there's a disaster, but also for annual planning, that it's actually part of their budget, so to speak. You also have the UN Community Development Fund's local project, which provides performance-based climate resilience grants, which are part of budgets that go down to local governments. And it's for adaptation, and it's again performance-based, so governments actually have to prove that they've done adaptation before they get top-ups on that. So there are quite a few examples there. But I'd also like to say that, we're not reinventing a wheel here, because we've done development for so many years now, and we've had so much learning on devolution, on how do we get funding to the local level that allows that kind of local determination. So we really, instead of trying to think of new ways, need to learn from that and bring in the good examples. And well, I don't have the time to give you the details, but I can tell you that at the GCA, we're now looking at a project, or rather a program that happened in urban informal settlement in Nairobi, Mukuru, which it was not a climate resilience project, but it has contributed so much to resilience, because the vulnerability comes from the fragile environment that people live in. So just by addressing that, they build resilience. But some of the learning really has been that you've got to work with the government. You need the local governments on site. You've got to try and take, to the extent possible, integrated approach. You can't necessarily come at these problems just from the angle of adaptation. This is something we've learned in the past with the environment as well, that you've got to get all the sectors, whether it's the poverty, rural development, water, agriculture sectors on board. So I mean, the partnership thing that I talked about earlier, one of the problems they found was that, you had so many different NGOs and groups and stakeholders working on different issues, different sectors, and they brought them all together so that, it was a coherent approach that they took. It was a devolved approach, it was a coherent approach. So there are really good examples out there that we need to bring in and use in this context, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anju. It's very nice to hear from all of your examples on solutions. I think it's important to know that despite the challenges, despite the obstacles that we see, there are ways to find solutions. And I want to also bring the next question to all of you again. So I'll make another roundtable for this question, because it's, as I was saying at the beginning, it's a very diverse panel that we have with us today. We have people from national, federal government, local governments, cooperation agencies, think tank, and international organizations. All of those in just 5 very VIP panelists. So I'll bring this question back to everyone again. I have the very nice capacity to see all of you in front of me, even those of you who are connected remotely. So if anybody wants to come in, instead of me pointing to your names, just feel free to raise your hand because I can see you. So the next question is basically, what do you think other sectors need to do? So we're talking about roles in sectors, be it national government, non-governmental, financial sector, private sector, and even I would say providers of climate finance, be it international finance funds or international agencies. What do you think they also need to do to help local communities access or improve access of local communities to climate finance? Is there anyone who would like to volunteer to go first? Melchior, can you go first?
Yeah, I can provide a number of elements. I think there are, as we heard from the different examples, really measures needed at all levels. So if we start at the levels of like high international climate funding, we have heard that measures are much too bureaucratic. So here it needs a review of how those funds are dispersed, how they're allocated. And we need to find mechanisms, and that they need to be devised in those institutions, at least as a principle, that it's not controlled outside the country what is in the end really the priority at the local level. I think that is the first one. The second one is we all agree here that adaptation is so important, but in our discussions internationally, it's not so clear that enough money is going to adaptation. So in the global finance discussion, much more money needs to be oriented towards adaptation to strengthen the livelihoods of people who are today impacted by the effects of climate change already. It's not taking money from mitigation to adaptation, but it's generating new funds for adaptation solutions. That is one. If you go now to the other side, which is much more local, then it needs a way how that can be influenced also outside local governments. I really appreciated this discussion that local government needs to be a very strong part of the picture. Now what we see is that local planning processes sometimes are not yet fully inclusive. And here maybe I can just give a very short example from Bangladesh, from a project which is called Bani Jibon. It's in the coastal areas of Bangladesh, which are often flooded. And here the issue is really access to drinking water. It's an issue for the women because they have the responsibility in the family to bring that water, but they are excluded from local political decision making. So the whole discussion, and there was also discussion facilitated and supported financially by the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, to say, okay, how can those excluded voices be a part in the discussion? And there was a local mechanism, like local women groups joining together and to say, we call ourselves Mothers Parliament, and we want to bring in our priorities to this local decision makers, local politicians. And what I really found interesting, in the beginning of that initiative, those local women, they were despised by the local decision makers. They said, oh, who are you women to bring that in? And then as they got organized and said, hey, we really have an issue and we explain it to you, and they learned also about the political processes at local level, they were increasingly heard. And then the local available budget was reshifted to priorities who were also important for those women, for that mother parliament. So it's also looking at the exact decision-making allocation measures at the local level. So it's not only the global finance which needs to change, but we need to be aware that power balances, including at the local level, might need support and adjustments, might not always be inclusive.
Go ahead, James, please.
Thank you. First, let me comment on her comment on the project in Mukuru in Nairobi. I was very excited about the County Climate Change Fund mentioned, because I know, yes, there's a direction we need to go. And mostly maybe in Mukuru, they're talking about the emissions and all that, because emissions affecting the environment, that's on waste, because a lot of that's a slum area. And we have similar projects, I can say that also in other parts, like we call Taka ni Mali, that is waste is wealth, whereby we are involving the local women in collecting waste and ensuring that waste, we add value onto that waste, and hence avoid the emissions which affect the environment. So I think I'm very happy with that. But I can say on this again, we need to identify gaps in climate finance mechanism at the grassroots level and create that ownership. Because for us to sustain whatever project we have at the county level, we must bring the aspect of ownership. we are going to sustain it. So I think there's an aspect of planning, aspect of governance, and also how do we create institutions which responds to the needs of the community. So I think we need to work on that together, the aspect of governance, the aspect of planning, and the aspect of institutional mechanism and capacity. But we cannot do that, but we have to understand and analyze which are these gaps which are making us not move with whatever speeds. And as we improve the mechanism, we need to look at critically the legal frameworks and how do we sustain this flow so that, as I said earlier, we don't have the barriers and we lessen the processes so that we can be able to move. And this aspect of the county climate change fund came as a result of also the Climate Change Act of 2016. And counties are also adapting that. So if that works, it means we are going to reach faster to the communities.
Thank you, James. Can I just ask technical staff to also bring Tisa to the screen? I only see Anju. I would like to see if Tisa is volunteering to respond. But go ahead, Minister. I saw you wanted to take the floor.
Yeah, you were asking what to do in order to mobilize more resources at the end in a practical way, more people doing something for the climate change. And I want to share a personal experience. I come from the private sector. This is my first experience in these 5 months as a minister. And I've been 30 years in the sustainable business movement. And the first 20 years when I was speaking to the private sector, I was trying to say, we need to save the world. We need to, we're going to die. This is a matter of survivance. And when you talk to people who is in the daily basis business, it's like an understandable language. It's like in a very high level, very technical level. And we need to mobilize 7 billion people working in daily practical things. So it came to my hands a study of a top 5 audit enterprise in the world, and they monetize the climate change. So since that day, when I was visiting a businessman to tell him, measure your footprint, do something, lower your. The language that started to mobilize in them, it was that, that if you measure these 6 gases, this audit, top 5 world audits, company audits in the world says that you're going to lower your expenses by 15 to 22%, and they were, really, what should I do? So I think that we that are in public policy, we that are, creating trying to mobilize billions of people, we need to speak in a language that they can understand really fast. That, for example, in my case, an hectare of a mangrove, the mangroves for countries like us that are in the coast, and that you have the threat of a tsunami or whatever, a mangrove really plays an important role. So we valorate the ecosystemic service of the mangrove in $89,000. Why? Because the community takes some resources from there, and they sell their resources and they protect it. But now the businessmen that are, in terms of volume, well, a lot of people, or not just the businessmen, the community, understood that fighting the climate change is a way to bringing money to the table or food to the table. So just to close the center idea of what I wanted to share is that we need to make it more simple, the language, we the politicians, for the community in order to work in the daily basis acts that will fight the climate change.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Minister. I think that's a very helpful reflection. We are almost running out of time, so we have probably time for one more answer, either Tisa or Andrew, if anybody wants to volunteer, maybe a 3-minute answer on what you think the roles of the different sectors should be. Could I maybe invite you, Tisa? Yes, you're already taking the floor. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay, hope you can see me now.
We can.
The types of finance that are significant comes from either the public sector or the private sector. And these two types of financing streams come with very different strings attached and very different requirements and bureaucracies which communities need to navigate. So both of these sectors will have to have some degree of adjustments and modifications to simplify their processes for communities. But I also wanted to highlight the functions would differ between the public and the private financing streams, and these two sectors need to understand this. If we are, usually how the economy works is that we have a job, we have income, we can use the income to buy assets, we can use the assets to get credit, we can use the credit to generate more income, to generate more wealth. Now that's exactly how it should work for communities as well, but some of the vulnerable communities that we work with, the farmers, the fishermen, they have very different types of assets and very different types of income. Their income might not come on a monthly basis. Their assets might not be in the form of a house. It might be in the form of a plot of forest or a few trees or a boat, And these different types of assets so far have not been well understood by the private sector financiers. And this is proven by how very, very little private financing actually flows to vulnerable communities. Very little financing flows to communities living on the coastline, smallholder farmers, because there's very little understanding of what kind of assets could be considered wealth. Now, from the public sector perspective, there's a lot of financing that goes to communities in the form of capacity building, in the form of, paying consultants to figure out what the communities want, and then making reports, and then being the go-between, basically, between the funder and the communities. Less funding goes into making sure that the communities have wealth and have assets that they can show to gain more access to finance. So I think there's space for both the public sector and the private sector financiers to meet in the middle, ease, kind of the requirements for credit, the requirements for collateral to include, very diverse kinds of assets, not just kind of the urban type of assets that banks normally finance or use as collateral. But the public sector also needs to understand this, understand that there's specific challenges that are faced by vulnerable communities and that they need help most in that area. And that's where the financing should go. Take away those barriers for them. That's where the public finance should focus on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tisa. And I think the last reflection that you were making also brings us to something that we usually discuss in the negotiations, and that is discussed here at the COP, and also evidenced in the biennial assessment of climate finance flows that the SCF of the UNFCCC puts out every couple of years. And it's that there is a very big imbalance globally in climate finance between mitigation and adaptation. And of course, this relates to the fact that adaptation projects, unlike mitigation, have a lower capacity to generate revenue, which of course limits their ability to access loans or reimbursable finance. So that is, of course, there is still a pending issue. Now, I would have liked to address many more questions with our distinguished panel, but we are running out of time. So I'm now going to invite Bianca Kreshmer from the Adaptation Fund to deliver a quick reflection and quick closing remarks of our event. So Bianca, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the event, as I'm sure our viewers have. I'm going to now invite you to take the floor and help us with a closing reflection from your experience.
Thank you very much, Andres, and thank you to all the wonderful panelists here in the room and on the screen. Thank you for having me to share some of the experience of the Adaptation Fund and all the practical examples on the challenges, but also the solutions for channeling financing from the international to the local level really resonate also with our work, the work of the Adaptation Fund. It's not an easy task to try to react to all of the things we've heard, but to mention first on some of the barriers that the speakers have mentioned is really also in our experience what the barriers are to really use the funding that is mobilized internationally and channel it to the local level for small projects, because often smaller projects have higher transaction costs, and there are not enough incentives for those. The traditional intermediaries therefore also often shy away from financing these smaller scale interventions. And of course, the Adaptation Fund is a fund that has been mandated to do so, to fund these concrete interventions that are a smaller scale, that benefit the most vulnerable countries and communities, that involve indigenous communities, gender, other vulnerable groups. And therefore, for the last almost 20 years now, the fund has really pioneered a design to take up these challenges and put in place various innovations. Of course, the direct access modality to enable national institutions to directly access financing, and most recently also enhanced direct access to really operationalize this principle that the decision-making over financing, and we have heard this from many speakers, that it's about this local determination of how funds are used for which sort of adaptation solutions, which are often best determined locally. So this enhanced direct access modality, from our experience, is also a very important modality that has been pioneered now and really has to be scaled up to allow the funding to go from the international level to the national level, and from there to subnational and local levels. So, for example, in a lot of projects funded by the Adaptation Fund in this regard, some of the strategies that are being used is that small grant facilities are put in place with open calls for proposals from community-based organizations, the private sector, indigenous groups. It's coupled with awareness raising and enhanced knowledge and technical capacities. These challenges have also been mentioned by many speakers. The governance has also been mentioned. So in this enhanced direct access modality, the goal, or they're often successful when they put in place governance arrangements that make use of local and traditional decision-making in that respective area, and that also engage local leaders. When it is most successful when local communities are paired with community-based organizations that have been operating that area for a long time. So I think in terms of also one of the concrete things that can be done is to incentivize international financial institutions and the climate funds to make use of these modalities by really bringing in criteria on the project level as well as on the institutional level that require more of these modalities. So, for example, in the Adaptation Fund, there are specific criteria for each project that wide-scale consultations have to be undertaken, that communities have to be engaged, both in the development in the project as well as in the implementation. There are also indicators for the results that really track then how much of this funding and capacity of the local level has been enhanced. And yes, I can only encourage that these kind of mechanisms on the institutional and project level would also be taken up by other funds, and that we can share a lot of this knowledge and these examples that we've also heard today with the international level to somehow reform the system more towards these approaches. And I see we're running out of time.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Bianca. Just to very briefly close in 15 seconds, I would like to thank everyone for your participation today. My big takeaways for this is we need multi-sectoral coordination, local, national, international level, local organization involvement in policy design and in decision-making processes, and opportunities to reflect on these issues like the one that was provided to us today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for everyone viewing the event. And it's been very nice to be with you all today. Thank you.